God buys a cup of coffee. There are some things in life that can't be passed on from one person to another. No matter how many times I try to tell the story, and no matter how hard I try to make it clear that this is what happened, people won't believe me. I could say that I spent my entire childhood sick, getting progressively worse as the years went on. I could say that I tried doctors and they failed me. I could say that I tried prescription medication, herbal remedies, and whatever else I could find, and they all failed. I could say that after I had exhausted all of my other options, I finally turned my attention back to my faith because it was all I had left. I researched and I read, and I reached a point of unconditional faith. Then, overnight, I was healed. Just like that, confirmed by doctors, and I never looked back. I could say all of that, and the true meaning of what I was saying would be lost. It just can't be conveyed. Even if someone told me that story, I would start thinking that maybe they were never really sick to begin with. Maybe they made themselves sick, or maybe they could make themselves believe that they were better. Maybe it was a childhood illness that went away with maturity. Maybe it never happened at all and they were spinning yarns for attention. Maybe they wanted to sell me on a fun new cult that they were starting. People don't see miracles, and they really don't want to hear about them either. So I'm not going to tell you the story of the sickness and the healing. I'm going to tell you another story. And this story is third-hand, just to make it that much easier to reject. The story, for me anyway, starts in a small diner. It's an unremarkable diner, in an unremarkable city filled with unremarkable people. I count myself among them, so don't think I'm being a snob. It's just the way the world is when you think about it. You pass how many people on the street every day? How many of them mean anything to you? So we've established that I'm not a motivational sort of person. Moving on. I walked into the diner just after the breakfast rush was over, when the smell of bacon and maple syrup still hung in the air, assuming it ever went away. It was too early for me to think about eating lunch, but too late for pancakes either, so I just sat down at the counter and ordered a cup of coffee. The waitress who poured my coffee was named Anne, according to the name tag on her red and white checkered printed uniform. She served me my coffee with a smile, and since she had no other customers to serve, she wound up lingering for a bit, and we discussed the term regular coffee and what different people expected to get with such an order, depending on where they come from. Normally, I'm not one for this type of small talk, but we struck up an easy conversation without my even realizing it. As I sipped my coffee, Anne tried to convince me to have a slice of pie. She told me that it was the perfect in-between meal food, because it was close enough to a breakfast pastry while fitting in with lunch or dinner, too. You can just say that you're eating your dessert first, she told me with a smile. She'd make a hell of a car salesman, but I wasn't in the mood for pie, so I shook my head and went on drinking my coffee. That's when she looked away and grinned. It was that sort of uncomfortable grin that people get on their face when they want to say something, but they don't really want to say it. They want you to ask them about it, so they feel more justified when it finally comes out. So I asked, "What's so funny?" "It's not funny," she said. It's silly. It's nothing." "I've spent the past 10 minutes discussing the finer points of regional diner dialect," I replied. "I'm not what you'd call discriminating." Anne turned back to me, still grinning and trying to find the words to start the story. She shook her head and rubbed her hand over her lips, and then said, "It was this customer that came in here a while ago." "What about him?" "He told me something, and I can't shake it. It's stupid." After some more urging from me, Anne told me the story. Apparently, this man was sitting at the counter, much like I was, drinking coffee much like I was, only he didn't make conversation for the longest time. He was just staring into his pure black coffee, letting his mind wander. This was during the breakfast rush, so Anne wasn't desperate for conversation, but as she was picking up a dirty plate from the counter, the man looked up at her and asked, "Have you ever met God?" I'm paraphrasing here, of course. I wasn't there for the conversation. Anne was thrown off by the question. She wasn't sure how to respond to the man, and he must have read it on her face because he said, "I mean face to face, eye to eye." Anne started. I guess I believe that God is with me." The man chuckled as though her reply was the most absurd thing he'd ever heard in his life. Anne was a little offended. She was about to move on with her day and find a nicer customer to talk to when the man said, "I have. I saw him, just as close to me as you are now, just as solid, just as real." Anne was trying to figure out whether or not an escaped mental patient was grounds for calling 911 at this point, or if she should just call the police department's main line. And there it is. The man smiled and nodded. You're looking at me like I'm the special kid at school. It's not every day that someone claims to have met God. You claim to know him personally, the man shot back. So is it so hard to believe that I'd meet him in passing? Touché, was all that Anne could think to say, though she assured me that she's usually more original with her comebacks. So, did he introduce himself as God? She was expecting the man to laugh at her joke, but he didn't. He shook his head and went back to staring into his cup. What did God say? What did he do? Anne asked. He bought me a cup of coffee. That was nice. Now the man grinned again and said, I was digging through my pocket looking for cash to pay for it myself. I had the money, but it was taking me a while, and the people behind me were getting huffy, so he just put it on his own bill and walked out of the place. A 50-cent cup of coffee. Did you thank him? The man looked up at Anne and said, No. There was a moment of quiet. Anne wasn't sure what to say to the man next. She had work to do, but it seemed rude to walk away from the man who claimed to have met God, so she stayed. Did you say anything to him at all? She asked. No. Then how do you know it was God? It was the million-dollar question. Everyone wonders what it would be like to meet God, right? The man thought about his answer for a moment and finally told Anne, It was like seeing your own father on the street after being apart for a year. It was like I'd known him my entire life and just never realized it. There was no question, no moment of hesitation, just the simple understanding that this was God. And nobody else noticed God right in front of them? The man shook his head and shrugged. He then told Anne, I'm an atheist for God's sake. Or I was. Now I don't know what I am. You met God. He bought you coffee. I'd think that would make you a believer. In his existence, yeah, the man said. But as I turned to walk away from the counter, I saw this woman sitting in the corner. She had a little girl with her, no more than 2 years old. The kid was a little puffy, worn around the eyes, no hair. She was sick, probably dying. Anne was cringing at the thought. She had a kid of her own, so she didn't even want to imagine such a thing. God was there. He was in that coffee shop with a dying kid, and I realized right then that there were people struggling to pay their mortgage. There were hospital bills, school bills, soldiers off at war, homeless people, sick people. The world is falling apart all around us, and God buys me a cup of coffee and just walks away from it. He didn't even look back. What was Anne supposed to say about this? All she could do was stand there, waiting for the man to finish his story and hope for a big tip when he left. The man shook his head and swallowed the rest of his coffee. He left a couple of dollars on the counter and walked away. That was that. Anne wasn't sure what to do with that story. It was insane, but she couldn't shake it. She couldn't just shrug it off and move on with her day. More than that, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do with the story. Was it true or not? Was the man completely off his rocker? Don't ask me. I'm just the guy who's telling you the story of a story. But I can tell you that I've seen enough in my life to make it impossible for me to write off entirely. Another customer walked into the diner and Anne went to serve him. I was done with my coffee, so I had no reason to hang around. As I stood up, I reached for my wallet, only to find the pocket empty. And I wondered to myself, where was God when I needed him?
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn.